gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet made known her kindred or her people, even as Mordecai had commanded her. For Esther did what Mordecai told her, as she had done when under his care. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigtha and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. But the plot became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther, and Queen Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. Now when the plot was investigated and found to be so, they were both hanged on a gallows, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. Let's pray together. Lord, now we turn our attention to your word. We turn our attention to this beautiful story of Esther. Help us to see the value in this passage, the value in our lives today, the reminder of your presence with us, working in what often feel like meaningless details. You are still present with us and working and moving in our midst, even when we don't feel like we see you or hear you. Be with us now as we turn our attention to this passage. Speak through your word. Illuminate the scriptures for our eyes to see it and understand it, and our hearts to comprehend it and put it into practice. For your name's sake, we do pray. Amen. Have you ever found yourself in the situation, some situation, can be any number of situations, that you think, what am I doing here? How did I end up here? Maybe it's a situation where you're in a place where you never expected to be. You found yourself around someone you never expected to be around at all. Or maybe you found yourself in a bit of a questionable situation, one that you really didn't want to find yourself in. And as we look at our passage today, I think you'll see that both of those actually prove true for Esther and Mordecai. Esther finds herself in quite a questionable situation with King Xerxes. And then Esther finds herself in a quite magnificent situation, becoming queen. Mordecai finds himself in quite a strange situation, hearing a plot against the king, but also finds himself in this situation where he can be a difference maker and a change maker within that situation. And so there's much for us to see in this passage, but I want to continue to remind us. I want to continue as we study through Esther. I want to hold out in front of us the interpretive lens by which we have to think about this book. The way that we think about the scope of this book is we have to remember Esther and all of the Old Testament is ultimately pointing us to Jesus. It's all ultimately pointing us to Christ, his life, death, and resurrection. And you may, and I'll continue to remind you of this, you may say, well, what does Esther have to do with that? God works through these unusual circumstances to protect his people, to protect his people that he had set apart. But this protection of this people wasn't just for the people, it was for his sovereign plan of salvation. And his sovereign plan of salvation, by protecting his people here, he's actually protecting the line that eventually gets to Jesus. So this book has great value for us as we see God's providential hand and God's sovereign plan. So, I always want to try to summarize our passage in one big idea. If I could summarize this passage in one sentence, this is what I would say. God places his people in strategic places to fulfill his plan of salvation. You may say, you don't know what I do. How is what I do strategic? Think about Pete said last week at the end of the service, he's talking about Nehemiah, he said, he was just the tea-boy, he's the cupbearer. Regardless of your role, regardless of your position, I think it's important for us to remember that God places his people in strategic places, sometimes even in ways we don't see or understand, to fulfill his plan of salvation. So it's good for us as we study Esther, yes, to look at the details and ponder on so many things that appear in this book, but also to zoom out. And see, God is working out a plan, an eternal plan to provide salvation for those that trust in Christ. So we'll follow the plot of this narrative passage. We'll follow the kind of three plot points that appear. Esther finds favor in the eyes of Hegai. Esther finds favor in the eyes of King Xerxes. And then Mordecai saves King Xerxes. So first, let's look at Esther finds favor in the eyes of Hegai. This is from Esther 2, verses 8 through 16. This is a rather long section. I didn't read it earlier, so I encourage you to read this week. But there's a couple of things to notice. Even going back to last week, in verse 3, it says Hegai is the king's eunuch. So I didn't talk about this last week, but it's important to note here. So it was common in this day, within a kingdom, they would actually recruit eunuchs because it was a way to protect the royal line. So they had eunuchs that could not taint or ruin the royal line of the king. And so here you see this seems to be the case. It appears over and over again that you see the king's eunuchs, these people to help take care of the kingdom. And you have Hegai that seems to be influential in this way. And so we notice a few things. We were introduced to Esther. And what happens with Esther now? We were introduced last week to Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai is Esther's cousin that has been raising Esther because her parents had passed. And we saw last week, we were introduced in chapter 2 that Vashti, Queen Vashti, had disobeyed the king. The king had removed her from her position. You saw gross mistreatment from King Xerxes towards Vashti and really towards women in general. And then you see at the beginning of chapter 2, he says, I'm looking for another queen now. Let's collect all of the beautiful women within the kingdom and let me choose which one I'd like to make my new queen. Quite unusual circumstances. And then in verses 5 through 7, we're introduced to Esther. And Esther enters the story, and we ended last week saying, what role might Esther and Mordecai have in this story? So all of these ladies had been gathered from all over the kingdom. The most beautiful women from all over the kingdom had been gathered for Xerxes to choose, and we're told that they're gathered in Susa to the custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch. That Esther was taken to the king's palace in the custody of Hegai, who was in charge of the women. So we see Hegai now. He's in charge of all of these women to watch over them. It says, now the young lady, this is talking about Esther in verse 9. The young lady pleased him and found favor with him. So he quickly provided for her with cosmetics and food. And then he gave her 7 choice maids from the king's palace and transferred her and her maids to the best place in the harem. So, Hegai meets Esther. And immediately, you see this language. And for us, we studied Ruth last year. There's a word that appears throughout this passage today that should remind us of Ruth. It says, and he found favor. She found favor in his eyes. Should remind us of this word that appeared over and over again in Ruth, this hesed. It's this Hebrew word that's God's favorable kindness. It carries with it that idea. Just to remind us, Esther doesn't mention the name of God. But the author purposely seems to do that. And here it says, but you see God's favorable care, even when he's not mentioned, even when his name is not brought up. And so, Hegai meets Esther and quickly places her in the best of the best places, cares for her. But verse 10 is very important for us to notice something. Esther did not make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. So we don't know if there was some hatred against the people of God. We don't know what exactly was going on in this situation. But we do see that Mordecai says, it's best not to say anything. Okay, and I want to say a few things here that's important for us. Oftentimes we come to stories like this, and we hold Mordecai and Esther up as the heroes of the story. But I want us to be reminded, throughout the Old Testament, all of the heroes that we hold up, they're only heroes because of what God did through them, not because of how spectacular they were. You actually see Esther and Mordecai here, and they're not exactly the most faithful of God's people. It says she eats of the food. Think back to Daniel. Daniel stood up. He was proudly a servant of God, of Yahweh, the one true God. He proudly refused to eat the food, and yet here we see with Esther, hey, hide who you are and go ahead and eat the food, blend in. Don't make it known who you are. And it should remind us, I mentioned it last week briefly, Jeremiah 29, you see that through Jeremiah that God said, when you go into exile, go there, live there, marry there, make lives there. And so I don't want to be so hard on Esther and Mordecai here, but at the same time, you also see that they're a bit fearful, afraid to even talk about who they are. But notice, even in their unfaithfulness, as it seems, that God still uses them, is still working for his plan of salvation. So, she doesn't make it known. She hides this fact. And then in verse 12, you see a bit more of what exactly was going on. As I mentioned last week, our scripture says Ahasuerus, which is the Hebrew version of Xerxes. So King Xerxes, it appears in these following verses that every night he was having a different woman from within the kingdom to come to see if that would be the woman that he would want to keep as his queen. Sexual acts are not explicitly mentioned, but they are alluded to. You continue to see that King Xerxes treats women as objects, doesn't love them, doesn't care for them. It's just something, who's the most beautiful one? Send them in, I'll choose from the group. And so imagine here, Esther is in this lineup, seeing how many days it may be until she goes, probably against her will, to spend the evening with King Xerxes. If she refused, it might mean death, might mean imprisonment. Quite an unusual circumstance for Esther to find herself in. And yet, this is the place that she finds herself. As we saw in our passage last week, in verse 7, now Esther was beautiful of form and face. So we're told she was a beautiful woman, a striking woman. And so you see this picture of these group of virgins. They'd go in for the evening with Xerxes, and the next day they would go out as concubines. Purity lost, mistreatment. You continue to see this picture of Xerxes, that he was just an oppressive, abusive man in many ways, even looking back to our passage last week. In verse 15 it says, now when the turn of Esther came to go into the king, they were given this opportunity to request anything they'd like to take in when they'd go and spend time with Xerxes. But she did not request anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the women, advised. And Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther has now the opportunity. What do you want to take with you? Is it food? What do you want to take in to gain his attention and his trust? She looks at Hegai, the king's eunuch, and says, what do you think? You know him. Really, she shows some great wisdom here in this, where she says, let me ask somebody that probably knows better than I ever would. We don't know what that is. We don't know what she did, but we do know that it says, Esther found favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So once again, this idea of favor, God's loving kindness, in the midst of a truly broken situation. Like, I read chapter 1 and chapter 2 to this point, and I'm just heartbroken as I read this. You see all throughout Scripture, all throughout time, all throughout kingdoms, you see abuse and abuse of power in so many different ways above and beyond what we see here. But even in the midst of the brokenness, even in the midst of the difficulty, you see this idea of Esther, one of God's people. She's gaining favor in the eyes of those around her. And then verse 16, it says, so Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, to his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. So if you remember, we started the book and it shows it's in his 3rd year of his reign. We're now in his 7th year of his reign, so quite a number of years have passed since he removed Vashti from her position. But you see favor for Esther from Haggai and everyone who saw her. And now, from here, we turn to our next plot point as we follow this, and Esther finds favor in the eyes of King Xerxes. And this is in verses 17 and 18. So imagine this. Just for a moment, try to put yourself in Esther's shoes, and what a terrifying situation she found herself in. Going in the evening to the king's royal chamber. She made a mistake. It could lead to death, imprisonment, so many things depending on how she responded here. And I'm sure she thought, she probably knew she was beautiful, but she probably thought, what are the chances that he chooses me? So at worst, she spends the rest of her life as his concubine, an object, and at best, she becomes queen. But she enters knowing that becoming queen is probably pretty unlikely. So I can only imagine entering the king's chamber would have been a very terrifying moment. A heartbreaking moment for her. A scary, scary moment for her. But verse 17, you continue to see that somehow in the midst of this brokenness, God is working. It says, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she found favor and kindness. There's that word again, hesed. Favor and kindness, God's loving kindness in the midst of this, with him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So last week we ended and we said, what is God doing here? What is God's purpose in the midst of this story about just gross mistreatment from a leader of great power? Esther was introduced in verses 5 through 7, and now in such a short amount of time, it says Esther meets the king and he falls for her, falls madly in love with her. He says, you will be the queen in Vashti's place. This is one of the most unlikely things you could ever think of, because part of why it was important for her most likely to hide who she was is it was common in that day for the king to go to the royal families of Persia to find his queen. So the likelihood of him choosing someone from Jerusalem is pretty small. And yet he does. It says, and he placed the royal crown on her head and made her queen. And then verse 18, it says, then the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. Notice what's not present here. I find it quite interesting. With Vashti, you had this banquet for her, and he objectified her. She refused. Hopefully he learned from that mistake here. You don't see that same request take place here. But you still see another one of these great banquets. And he also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. So you see this idea. He throws this banquet, and then he also has this day. Literally, the word is like it carries with it this day of rest. So one of two things seem to be the case when we think about this. It's either a day with no taxation or a day that's a true holiday. But you see, he's so taken by Esther that he says, let's have a day of rest. Let's have a day off. Let's have a day of celebration. And most would argue that it is some kind of holiday. He says, let's take a day off to celebrate Esther. Imagine if you're Esther, that she goes from being an outcast. It's been removed from her home country, her home place, her home city, and now she finds herself sitting in the royal court, being celebrated as queen. From a human perspective, it makes no sense. But from God's perspective, you begin to say, what is he doing? What is his purpose here? What is his plan for her as queen? And as the story goes, you begin to see that these characters we were introduced to last week, in Mordecai and Esther, God has a great plan to use them for his sovereign purposes. And so, Esther has found favor in the eyes of Haggai, the king's eunuch, and now Esther finds favor in the eyes of King Xerxes. And finally, we turn our attention to another unlikely circumstance. We see Mordecai now saves King Xerxes. This is in verses 19 through 23. Verse 19 is a bit of a confusing passage. If you want to read a lot of commentaries and spend a lot of time trying to understand exactly what happened here, it says, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. So a couple of things. Some have argued this is like looking back at the past. So when the virgins were gathered, when Xerxes was trying to choose who would be his wife, that Mordecai was sitting at the city gate, the king's gate. Some have argued that this is actually another time, even after he's now made Esther queen, that he's gathered virgins, which is highly possible. It would fit his character, that is this character of treating women as objects and mistreating women. But regardless, we see, once again, when the virgins were gathered, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Well, what we don't really think about is oftentimes the city gate in this time period was where decisions were made, where judgments were made, where magistrates met. And so it says he's sitting here, and so many have speculated that either in his own accord he's now become a judge or a magistrate, or through Esther's influence, she's had him placed into a position of authority. But he's sitting at the king's gate. So at this point, we realize we were introduced to these characters, exiles from Jerusalem, and now, within a few short verses, Esther's queen and Mordecai seems to be of a place of influence at the city gates. Once again, we're reminded that Esther has not yet made it known who she is, who she's related to, what her heritage is. We quickly see in the following chapters that Mordecai was known who he was disliked for who he was, as we look at Haman in the following weeks. But in verse 21, we see something interesting. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's officials from those who guarded the door, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes. So he's sitting at the gate now. And he overhears two talking about, I've had enough of this guy. Let's get rid of him. Putting hands on him carries with it this idea of murdering him. And what's interesting is this actually eventually was the way that Xerxes died. His doorkeepers ended up killing him. So, adds validity all the more to this as we look at this, where it's like there was a plot about this. Later, this kind of plot actually came to fruition in taking of Xerxes' life. But you have these two individuals, but the plot became known to Mordecai. And notice here, it says Mordecai told Esther, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. So in God's timing, in his sovereign plan, Mordecai happened to be in a position to hear this news. Esther happened to be in a position for Mordecai to pass the news. Esther happened to have the ear of the king to pass the news along and probably save his life. It says, now the plot was investigated and found to be so. And they were both hanged on a gallows. Literally, it carries this idea of they were hanged on a tree. Some have argued that it's crucifixion. No one's really sure exactly what it means here, but they were killed. And it says, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. So Mordecai, and I spent a lot of time this week pondering on this. Mordecai finds himself in an interesting, challenging situation. He knows who this king is. Cruel and unjust man. He becomes aware of an assassination attempt. And I couldn't help but think this week of how would I have responded in that situation? Would I have said anything, or would I have said, it might be good for him to go? I thought immediately of Dietrich Bonhoeffer from Germany. He was a theologian that was known to participate in the assassination attempts of Adolf Hitler. The moral conundrum he must have found himself in this situation of, what do I do? How do I handle this? And when we find ourselves in such situations, I bet may we be people that pray and seek the Lord of how is best for us to move forward here. But we see his choice is to make it known to the king. And something interesting happens. Basically, no thanks for it. It's like, it became known, they killed the man, and they wrote it in a book. It's like he's a cliff note in a history book somewhere. But what's interesting is how God ends up using this little notation in this book. You have this idea that it was written down, and then as we'll see in chapter 6, after it's written down, the king can't sleep in chapter 6, and he says, hey, come have this book read to me. And in God's timing, it ends up protecting Mordecai's life as Haman is seeking to take his life. But we see God's hand in the midst of all that is going on. We see that God is working even in the midst of really, really unusual circumstances. And so, as I always want to try to do, I always want to try to move towards, how do we apply this passage to our lives now? What does this passage mean for us today? Well, my first question as we think about this says we often view Mordecai and Esther like examples to follow. But have you ever realized that they were not ideal examples of followers of God? Like we read the Old Testament, we often say, if I could just be like this person. But if you read about Abraham, he was a failure over and over again. If we read about David, he was an adulterer. If we read about Esther and Mordecai, you see that they hid who they were. They were afraid. Have you ever realized that actually these examples, they're usually not ideal? But the story of the Bible is not to celebrate these individuals. The story of the Bible is to celebrate that God used these individuals for his plan. That God used broken individuals to further his plan of salvation. And so my second question follows. Instead, I ask, have you realized that God is often working through extremely broken people and situations? Like, what an encouragement for my heart that is. I look at my own life, how broken I am. As a person, how sinful I am. Situations in life, I look at the world around me, I think how broken it is. So if you realize that God is often working in the midst of this, we read the story and we just see brokenness, sinfulness. Have you realized that God's working through extremely broken people and situations? Third question. Like I said, I wrestled with this question all week long. Like Mordecai, do you do the right thing even if it does not seem to benefit you in any way? Became aware of an attempt to murder. He says, this needs to be talked about. And it actually leads to the murder of the two that were planning it. Quite a challenging situation. But for our lives, this should lead us to questions like, if you're an accountant and you notice that you've made a small financial mistake, do you actually tell your supervisor, even if it might harm you even if it might reprimand you in work? Do you do the right thing, even if it's not going to be celebrated? One pastor I enjoyed to listen to his sermons, he often asked the question, do we do what's right and what's best? Do we ask this question as Christians? What is right? What is best? Now, sometimes, such as this situation, you're left with really hard decisions to make. But do we do what is right and what is best? And then the final question. Do you trust that God is using the events of your life to fulfill his sovereign plans? Do you really trust that? Do you really look at your life and say, God is using my life in ways that I'll never understand fully to fulfill his sovereign plans? Because ultimately we'll see with Esther, God is using this situation to save his people. The story, we read it and we go, where is this going? But we get to the end and we see that God was using it all in the midst of the brokenness, in the midst of the difficulty. So in the same way, do we in our lives trust that God is using the events of our lives to fulfill his sovereign plan? Do you really think about your life in that way? That the events of your life matter? Even the things that you think, what's it all matter? What's the point of this? My job's not, it's not ministry, it's not this, it's not that. You can go down the list of things and say, but my job is not. But you never know how God might use it. Mordecai was probably a judge and happened to be in the place to hear this at this very moment. An assassination attempt. You never know how God will use your life. So do you actually trust that God is using the events of your life to fulfill his sovereign plans, to providentially care for his people even? And I encourage us as we think about this book to shift the way we think about our lives. We sit beneath an all-powerful God. But yet, books like Ruth, like we looked at last year, and books like Esther, we're reminded that God is working. God is moving in what seem like normal, everyday, even secular events. They don't feel overly spiritual. And yet, God is using these for his purposes. So I pray and I hope that we see value in our lives in even the mundane things that we do. That we seek to do what is right and what is best, that God may use it for his glory and his kingdom.